Okay, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really happy that you show interest in my take on ethics in what I call multi-sided online and offline ethnographic research. Here's a brief overview of my talk. First, I will account for how ethics can be seen as a social process and how this is bound up with the understanding that ethnographic research constitutes a relational event. And next, I will focus on processes of gaining informed consent and the relational work of negotiating access to the participants and the field sites. And finally, I will shed light on the ethical aspects associated with the representation of the participants after the fieldwork. Ethics is not only an important topic and considered as one of the cornerstones when carrying out research among real people in real-world situations, online as well as offline. Ethics is also a really delicate topic to speak about and to discuss, even in an academic setting like this, because a researcher's ethical compass does not only resonate with his or her view as a moral professional, but also his or her view on human sociality and basically how to behave as a decent human being. Therefore, I believe a researcher's ethical compass reflects a mixture of local, cultural, and societal practices, academic norms, national as well as international, and not least individual beliefs about the world. And these are, of course, not fixed, but can be more or less explicitly brought up for negotiation in people's everyday encounters. And in my talk today, I want to focus on the social encounter of the researcher and the participant in the context of ethnographic fieldwork across online and offline situations. But before we look further into this encounter, I want to begin by addressing the most fundamental principle of ethics, the principle of care. Because as Bolstoff and colleagues argue, any set of research ethics guidelines and dicta will be ineffective if researchers do not have embedded into their practice strong values establishing ethical behavior built on the principle of care. And just to mention a few issues related to this principle, which are relevant for my talk here today, I would like to emphasize ensuring informed consent, avoiding to cause harm, or maybe even more precise, to take care of the participants and their social relations, assuring the participants' anonymity, and aiming for an accurate portrayal of the participants and their everyday lives. Of course, the principle of care should be seen as an ideal, but nevertheless, it should also be seen as an integrated part of our ethical reflections. One of the go-to resources, in my opinion, when doing online or internet research is the Association of Internet Researchers, which has published reports containing ethical recommendations and guidelines since 2002. And such official ethical guidelines are indeed useful and contain many well-informed and well-intentioned recommendations for ethical behavior and not least reflection. And in my opinion, they constitute a solid foundation to build on. And that is a foundation that aligns with the ideals of ethical pluralism, not in the misunderstood sense that everything goes, but in the sense that one should acknowledge the legitimacy of specific local norms, practices, etc., while nonetheless conjoining these across significant differences with more encompassing and shared norms, values, and so on. Following from this, they argue in favor of a so-called process approach, which takes its point of departure in self-reflection and sharing of experiences with co-researchers and colleagues. Yet, such a process approach should not only include discussions among trusted academic peers and colleagues, it should also include the perspectives of the participants, or as Christina Allen phrased it, research ethics are dialogical agreements that develop over time between researchers and the participants of the research study. And when expanding the relational and dialogical process of ethics to also encompass the participants, we need to nuance notions such as ethical decision-making, which may appear misleading when understood as if it's only the field worker who makes ethical decisions, Rather, ethical decision-making should be perceived as a more or less explicit collaborative activity, and understood as being a part of the ongoing development of human relationships during the process of fieldwork. While many ethical guidelines are helpful in reminding us how to reflect on ethical challenges, they by and large pay less attention to describing how researchers can elevate the ethics of online research to be studied empirically in its own right. And there are, of course, exceptions to this. But one way to approach the study of ethics as a social process is by paying analytical attention to a social situation characterized by a heightened level of metascientific reflexivity among the fieldworker or the participants. And according to Candefors and Mears, such metascientific reflexivity among lay members can be particularly active precisely in and during fieldwork encounters and in the entire research event, which according to them is complicating the idea of a pure and disinterested description and understanding. In this way, they argue that metascientific reflections should be treated as real data and not inauthentic data ready for being sacrificed on the altar of the observer's paradox. Rather, they believe that participants' insights and experiences of being a research subject should be included in linguistic ethnographic descriptions. This is the case because such reflections, among other things, helps us to understand research as a relational event between fieldworkers and participants, which ultimately is conditional of the fieldworker's perception and later representation of the reality he or she studies. And such reflections are also, according to Candefors and Mears, enable the researcher to engage with issues of power, voice, and representation. And adding to this, I would argue that attending to metascientific reflexivity also enables the researcher to engage with issues of ethics. And that's precisely what I want to do in the rest of my talk by attending to empirical data from my current research project called So-Me Family. The So-Me Family project is a collaborative research project carried out by 7 researchers, all based in Copenhagen. And the overall purpose of this project is to investigate which communicative functions social media serve in the family and how social media affect and facilitate family socialization today. And this is studied by employing a linguistic ethnographic perspective on family life across online and offline contexts. And this approach is characterized by a so-called offline first strategy, where the contact to the participants are made prior to carrying out the online ethnography. And such approaches has also been described in terms of being blended or multi-sided or post-digital. With regard to the fieldwork, we have carried out fieldwork over a period of 7 months. We started our fieldwork in 2 classes at a Copenhagen high school during a period of 3 months. The fieldwork included around 80 field visits in which 1 or more fieldworkers carried out participant observation in the classes and in the breaks. And besides from following the students, we also asked them to carry out self-recordings in various school and leisure time situations to be able to see how they talked about social media during the day. And later we also carried out semi-structured interviews and media go-along conversations with the adolescents, which are conversations where the participants reflect on their media use together with a field worker who meanwhile records the screen of the participant's computer or smartphone. We also carried out, we also created researcher profiles on Instagram, Facebook, and Snapchat, which constituted the backbone of the students' local polymedia environment. And this environment was created during the first few days of attending the new school and consisted of a shared messenger group, a shared Instagram profile, and a Snapchat group. And after a period of 3 months, we sent out a letter to the families of the participants asking for permission to continue our fieldwork in their families. And 14 of the families agreed to participate, and during the following 4 months, we paid each family 2 to 4 visits. And during these visits, we conducted interviews with the participants and siblings and carried out media go-along conversations with the family members. And parallel to visiting the families, we also carried out online ethnography by following family members on Facebook and Instagram. I won't tell you more about this phase because I will mainly focus on the ethical challenges related to the multi-sided ethnography in the school phase. And the first challenge that I would like to address is getting access to the field site and obtaining informed consent among the participants. When collecting online data, the researcher is responsible for providing the best conditions for the participants to exercise their agency in terms of deciding whether to participate in the project or whether not to. Christine Mortensen defines such agency as the socio-culturally mediated capacity to choose or to say no. And furthermore, she argues that institutionalized procedures of informed consent may undercut participants' agency. And along the same lines, Barry Thorne and others warns against reducing informed consent to a signature on a piece of paper, because such ritualized procedures may result in meaningless rituals rather than improving the ethics of the field research. Still, the burning question is how to ensure that the participants are sufficiently informed and that consent is truly given, and how to draw the line between being informed and uninformed. And I won't be able to provide a clear-cut answer to these questions. I don't think anybody can, but I will be able to show you what the process of gaining informed consent may look like, both from a participant and a researcher perspective, by looking at metascientific reflections from different stages of our multi-sided ethnographic fieldwork. And the data that I rely on are field diaries and the participants' metascientific reflections in the Snapchat group. During the first week of fieldwork, we introduced the project and began the process of gaining informed consent. This process can be crystallized into two parallel and to some extent interconnected trajectories: a formal trajectory with the purpose of getting a signature on a piece of paper, and a more informal trajectory where the main researcher activities consisted of talking to individual participants, building a trust-based relation, negotiating access to different social domains, and not least making sure that the participants kept being informed about what we were doing and where we were doing what throughout the process. The formal trajectory of informed consent began the first day of school, where we asked the teacher for permission to approach the class. We introduced ourselves, we told them a bit about being a language researcher and about our research project, and that is without saying too much. We also handed out a folder about the project, which they were instructed to give to their parents, and finally we also started a dialogue on what social media they used for what purposes. And in the end of this 10-minute session or so, we asked whether they would like to participate in the research project, and we made it clear to them that once they had decided to participate, they would have to get their parents to sign the consent form that we also handed out. Only one of the participants approached us afterwards and refused to participate. And we made it clear to him that we would not use his voice or his writing in any way or in any form in the project. Yet, this formal trajectory of gaining informed consent should not be romanticized, because as I will show you in a minute, it does not provide a guarantee that the adolescents are aware of or remember what you are doing as a field worker. Also, the fact that we already gained permission from the school and the teachers to be present made it more difficult or maybe even socially marked for the adolescents to opt out, a fact that rendered visible the unequal power relation between the ethnographer and the participant. As you can see from my first field diary, we furthermore encouraged the adolescents to come and talk to us about the project, which can be seen as an initial attempt to initiate the informal trajectory of the process of informed consent. As you can also see, we advertised our researcher profiles on social media, which we had prepared before entering the field. And for ethical reasons, we also made it very explicit that they actively had to befriend us and invite us to get access to the groups that they wanted us to participate in. And this was something that we had to remind them repeatedly and was a guiding principle to support the agency of the participant in the very act of granting us access. During the first week, most of the adolescents had sent us a friend request on Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat. And then the next step was to gain access to the more private context of their polymedia environment, such as negotiating access to their Messenger and to the Snapchat groups. And actually, it was surprisingly easy to be invited to participate in the Snapchat group of the class, as we were invited by one of the participants called Omar during an informal conversation in break between two classes. But as you should see in a minute, it was an ethical challenge to make sure that everybody was aware of and felt okay with us being present in this highly social, private social space. After Omar, he added our SoMe family profile to the group. I was very explicit about that he should check with the others if it was okay. But to my knowledge, he never did so in an explicit way. Without previous experience in doing fieldwork in Snapchat, I carried out the first round of data collection while sitting in my office here at the university. I collected screen data by means of the iPhone's inbuilt screen recording function, and each time I carried out a recording session, all members of the group received a notification from Snapchat saying the SoMe family project has made a screenshot, as you can see here. And after having scrolled for a few minutes, I saw this chain of messages, which made me realize that not all of the participants were aware of our presence in the group. And please note that this correspondence took place a few days before I entered the group for the first time. And here we see how Omar, the participant who invited us to participate in the group, reminded the others about our presence by saying, "Hold your horses, behave, May. Remember, the researchers can see everything." And this was written as a reaction to a linguistically heated interactional sequence about what happened in the weekend during a party that they all attended. And Omar's utterance here is interesting in several ways. It can be seen as a kind reminder to the others, but it can also be interpreted as if he felt obliged to tell the others in an implicit way that he had granted the researchers access to the group. And this interpretation is qualified by the reactions of some of his classmates, which are interesting because they contain metascientific reflections that shed light on the participants' understanding of being subjects in a scientific study. The three first reactions can be interpreted as expressions of being surprised, slightly dismissive, and skeptical of our intentions. Yet both Maya and Carl here seems to downplay our presence by writing, "They have seen worse and they will love it." Omar's laughter in the two messages here can be seen as a means to mitigate the fact that he has granted the researchers access to the group, which is followed by an explanation of why we are present, that is, to analyze our language, as he writes. In this way, we are being ascribed different roles and identities as researchers, from a surveying authority by comparing us to Big Brother and writing, "Do they seriously check it all?" and to accepted bystanders by writing, "They love it," and to professionals or language researchers by writing, "They have seen worse and they analyze our language," understood in the sense of some kind of language police, which is indexed by the metapragmatic comment, "Please behave," and the metalinguistic activity of correcting a spelling mistakes, something that they rarely do in these very private online spaces. So in this early stage of the research, we see how various roles and identities are being ascribed to the fieldworker and how the fieldworker's access to the field site is questioned. In such cases, it's up to the fieldworker to negotiate these roles and relations and to renegotiate the access to the field site. But in this case, I did not have the opportunity to negotiate or address how they perceive my presence in real time because, as I mentioned earlier, the conversation took place a few days before I came across it. So from a methodological point of view, this excerpt indicates that field roles are something that you can rarely plan in advance or be in complete control over as a field worker. From an ethical point of view, the most important take-home message from this correspondence was that not all of the students was aware of our presence in this social context. And I must admit that my initial reaction when I discovered this disalignment between the participants was that I got slightly worried. Yet on the other hand, I was also slightly relieved to see how fast they moved on to a new topic, and not least how Omar handled the situation on behalf of us. And in retrospect, I would however agree that this might not have been the most easiest situation for him to be in. Along these lines, the extract also bear evidence that the participants in more or less explicit ways also participate in the process of negotiating access and play a role in the process of gaining informed consent from peers. And finally, it also shows that informed consent and gaining access is quite a complex task in multi-sided ethnographies, as we have seen how the consent and access is given in one situation does not necessarily apply in other everyday contexts. So this suggests that every time you enter a new context or a new corner of the field, you should make sure to more or less explicitly renew or revisit the informed consent form. And now let's have a look at how we did so in the SoMe Family Project. During our debriefing session the next day, we agreed that we needed to make ourselves more visible and available when carrying out fieldwork in the Snapchat group. Therefore, we decided to merge or to bridge the online ethnography with the offline participant observations we carried out in school. So the next time we collected data, we carried out the screen recordings during class. And I told one of my co-field workers to observe how the adolescents reacted to our online presence. When I carried out the screen recording, my colleague Marianne reported the following in her field diary. Andreas makes a screen recording in the Snapchat group. Dennis and Maya react to the recording. Maya says, "We have sent all kinds of crap." They also mention that they almost forgot that we were present. So here we see how the participants became aware of their online behavior and language use when they were reminded that they were being observed. And in fact, this kind of attention to our presence was quite normal during the first few weeks of fieldwork, where they sometimes accounted for their behavior when they became aware of our presence in face-to-face situations. And somehow this heightened level of metascientific reflexivity in the beginning of the fieldwork can actually be seen as beneficial from an ethical perspective, as it facilitates a dialogue between the fieldwork and the participants, where personal and professional boundaries are being constructed and relations and roles negotiated. Yet with time, and as we further gained the trust of the participants, the need to account for their behaviors became less pronounced. But very importantly, the metascientific awareness never completely disappeared, as I will show you later. When entering the field site of school the next day, I remember being slightly unsure of how to go about collecting data in the Snapchat group. One of my many concerns was, of course, that they would not let us continue to collect data in this highly valuable setting. And due to the attention our online fieldwork have received, we decided to address the activity in class to make sure that all of the participants knew that we had been granted access in the Snapchat group. And I reported the following. When the teacher gives me the floor, I introduce Marianne. Next, I tell them about our online fieldwork. I explain how we carry out screen recordings of their class profiles on Snapchat and Messenger. And I emphasize that we won't or we don't show or share anything with the teachers or parents. If one should be slightly self-critical here, I made an a priori ethical assumption here, in the sense that I assumed that privacy in relation to the parents and teachers was at the top of their list. Yet, one can argue that the participant might not share this particular concern, but they are maybe rather worried to embarrass themselves in front of some strangers, which we indeed were in the beginning, who had just joined their private youth context. So this raises an important ethical issue, whether researchers and participants share the same concerns in terms of, for instance, short and long-term effects of ethical decisions. And furthermore, choosing class as the context of this talk is only ideal in terms of ensuring that most participants receive the message, but this context does not invite for critical questions or informal talk. In the last class of the day, we decided to make a new recording of their Snapchat activity that day, also referred to as the test. And this is how it played out. I can hear the sound of push messages from 2 phones in the class when I do it. It's a push message that informs them that we carry out a screen recording. Marianne and I go to the hallway area. We place ourselves near the groups of teenagers to observe. Maya has seen the push message and she shouts that we have made a recording. I've moved quietly to her seat and ask how she saw it, and then we talk a bit, that is, about why we record. Afterwards, I take a round to the other students. They overheard our conversation, and I tell them that they can always come to us if they have posted anything or any pictures that they do not want to use. Maya says that she does not post anything that we are not allowed to see. The test serves the intended function, namely that it facilitates a dialogue about our recordings and what we are doing online, and that we have the opportunity to de-dramatize our online presence. So here we see a reported example of how ethnographic fieldwork and data collection unfolds as a dialogical and relational event between the researcher and the participants. And in this case, the fieldworker takes an active participation role in the attempt to renegotiate the inherently unequal power relations between the fieldworker and the participants. Because by being explicit about that they at any time can ask us to delete data, we aim at empowering the teenagers with a relatively high degree of agency or co-determination in what they choose to share or rather not share with us. In addition, the dialogical nature of this research event also contributes to re-inform the participants about what we are doing. In this sense, informed consent as a process is incorporated into the method of data collection, as it allows for metascientific reflections to be addressed. In order not to romanticize this research event, I would like to stress that this one test in the beginning of the fieldwork did not magically change how the adolescents perceived our online presence. Rather, this example should be seen as one among many similar relational initiatives to create an understanding of our researcher practices, to keep their consent informed, and as a stepping stone towards the trust-based relation we managed to establish with most of the adolescents during the first month of fieldwork. And I also want to stress that at the time of doing this fieldwork in these early stages, I, of course, did not have this level of metascientific reflexivity. So there was plenty of opportunity to make premature decisions and to over or misinterpret social situation. And I would like to share one such situation with you. In the afternoon, after having been in the field the whole day, after having written my field diary and thus reflected on the test that we carried out, I nevertheless decided to make a final screen recording before going on weekend. And remember, the Snapchat data I was about to collect would otherwise have disappeared over the weekend because of the ephemeral nature of Snapchat interactions. So I found myself in a well-known situation where I had to balance ethical dilemmas with the inherent desire to collect useful data. So I'm sitting in my office and I'm probably thinking very naively that we have solved the problems. Please remember how I described the test as a success in the field note. And despite what Maya said earlier the same day about allowing us to see everything she posts, the following happened when I started recording. To understand Maya's reaction, we need some additional context. She's at a restaurant with her father and she posts a short video snap where she quickly pans from her food on her plate to her father, who sits on the other side of the table. And the video has been added the caption, "I have alcohol in the bag and he doesn't know." And this is a big deal because her parents are divorced and her mother has allowed her to drink respectfully when attending parties, she told me in an interview. Yet her biological father is against drinking because of his religious beliefs. And this explains why this is a very private message and a socially heated situation for Maya. And somehow this situation can be seen as a repetition of what happened earlier the same day at school. Remember that Maya was the one who brought our online presence to the other's attention. Yet this time, she does so in a digitally mediated mode of communication, and because of the geographical distance, I have to deal with this situation in writing. And I must admit that I remember my heart pounding in my chest when I saw this message. And my instinctive feeling was, everything is lost, they're going to kick us out of the group, it's too private. But shortly after, the others started to comment. As you can see, Mark and Naima post a written representation of laughter, suggesting that they find the situation amusing, maybe because it can be seen as slightly awkward for Maya, who writes, "They are watching right now." Still feeling rather anxious, I had to think fast in terms of how to address this situation. And despite having been through something very similar earlier at school, this was somehow different because I felt rather limited in my scope of actions. For instance, I had a hard time interpreting the seriousness of Maya's reaction because I had only very limited knowledge about the digital communication culture in class, Maya's stylistic repertoire, and emoji use in particular. Yet today, after having known Maya for a long time, I would not have reacted with the same level of anxiety because of her tendency to dramatize and to perform in front of her classmates. So what I was balancing here was the ethical dilemma of not further overstepping Maya's boundaries and not responding in a way where I would come off as an overtly worried idiot in front of her and in front of the rest of the class. And I remember thinking that the most marked and ethically wrong action in this situation was doing nothing. So I decided to make myself more visible in the situation by posting a message. After a few seconds, I start writing the following. Have a nice weekend, everybody. See you next week. And this resulted in other participants joining the conversation, and I was happy to see there more relaxed responses, such as Hanan's see you and thumbs up, and Omar's orale, so me, which is a street language expression that can be interpreted as a burst of joy when you're pleased to hear something. Yet, I still wanted to try to address Maya's reaction and let her know that I would not tell her father or anyone else for that matter. And then I started typing the following. And cool that you let us join the group, by the way. But then in the heat of the moment, I could not decide whether this was a good way to respond. And on top of this, I was not yet fluent in using a Snapchat or particularly comfortable in balancing social relations in the context of Snapchat. And on top of all this, my phone was running out of power. So I decided not to post the message before my phone died. Maybe not the best decision I made during my time in the field. But nevertheless, this excerpt shows how ethically informed research practices come out of processes of deliberation and decision-making under great uncertainty, which often may go wrong or seemingly force us towards less ideal options. The first day back at school, after what felt as a very, very long weekend, I made sure to talk to Maya and to address what happened before the weekend. I talked to Maya while walking up the main stairway. I inquired into her reaction when I recorded the Snapchat data. I asked if it was okay that I recorded the picture of her hiding the liquor in her bag. She says that it is okay, and subsequently she adds, yes, you also need to be present here. And I actually remember being quite surprised that she did not make more of the episode compared to my own interpretation of the situation. But with this response, I decided to continue collecting data in the Snapchat group, but for the following month or so, we only did so when we were co-present in school. Yet later on, we sometimes made departures from the usual practice during the weekends if we wanted to see what was going on while not spending time with the participants. This field note is written roughly 1.5 months after the incident with Maya, and as you can see, I'm in the process of creating a trust-based relation to the participants. When the class ends, Nabil gives me a hug. I say, have a nice party. They are going to a party in the evening. The day after, Saturday, I download the snap. I usually do not make recordings in the weekend because I think that they are also entitled to some privacy on Snapchat. Because I have talked to them about the party during the break, I decide to make an exception. When I've seen all of the pictures, I decide to write a message in the chat. I think it makes me appear less like a stalker. During the following week, I mentioned to some of the students that I saw how fun they had at the party, and they confirmed. As you can see from this excerpt, ethical deliberations the ethical deliberations that led to deriving from the usual practice was informed by a previous conversational event and the trust-based relation I had developed by spending a lot of time with the teenagers. In this sense, the ethics of maneuvering in an online space such as Snapchat is closely connected to the process of constructing and negotiating social relations and field roles, and in this case, relations and roles that cannot be meaningfully separated from those constructed and ascribed in offline social contexts. The final excerpt that I want to show you is from the very last day of fieldwork at school. At this point in time, I have followed the class for approximately 3 months, several times a week, and I have established a good relation with many of the participants, also with Nabil, whom we also met in the previous excerpt. The relation that Nabil and I have established built on a foundation of humor and irony, where mutual teasing constitutes an important social practice. This becomes evident in this excerpt, where we shall see how the observer becomes the observed. I write the following in my field diary. I've been ordered to sit at Eva, Mark, Kaya, and Nabil's table. I screen record the snap on my phone. Nabil notices it because of the push message. He begins to make a video of me and says jokingly, "Here's something for you to record." When I see it, I look straight into the camera and I say in an ironic tone, "You little stalker." This is a recurring joke where he has previously called me a stalker, and I generally feel comfortable to go to the limit with Nabil. And here you can see some of the screenshots from the video that he made with the captions, "Screenshot this," and "Caught with the hands in the cookie jar." What is particularly interesting about this interactional episode is that Nabil partially subverts the existing social order by making the observer the observed. In addition, he positions me as someone who is being exposed while carrying out a dubious act by writing "Caught with the hands in the cookie jar." And by calling him a little stalker in this situation can actually be seen as a one-up, as he's also being positioned as someone who is engaged in a questionable activity. In this way, the subversion of the social order can actually be seen as a co-constructed endeavor between the participant and the field worker in this situation. But most importantly, it shows how social media allow participants to confront and to subject researchers to their own practice. But please note that this happened after a certain degree of trust has been established between the field worker and the participants. This episode is also interesting from a methodological point of view, because it serves as an example of how metascientific reflections render visible ethnographic research as a relational event, and how researchers sometimes get entangled into the everyday flows of interactions that constantly occur across online and offline contexts. Yet, such entanglement should, as Jaspers and Mewes argue, be seen as an ethnographic opportunity rather than signs of failure or distortions of the actual data. In the last part of the presentation, I would like to draw attention to the fact that the process of ethical deliberations do not end with the fieldwork. Rather, ethics also extends the trajectory into the process of analysis and publication. And what I want to briefly address is how ethical deliberations are and should be an inherent part of how we represent the voices or the keystrokes of the participants we study. Within the ethnographic tradition, the participant perspective plays a central role in how we represent the participants in their everyday lives, which can be summed up by Malinowski's classical conclusion that the purpose of an ethnography is to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, and realize his version of his world. One of the challenges to meet this ideal, in my opinion, is to try to balance the researcher and the participant perspectives in the analysis of the participants' everyday interaction encounters. This entails not only carrying out pure researcher interpretations of what the participants do with language, but also rely on the participants' meta-pragmatic and meta-linguistic reflections, and in this way make allowance for the participants' own interpretations and understandings of their social linguistic reality to shine through their representations. Yet, it would be naive to think that we can completely avoid data biases in this way, because it's ultimately up to the participants as active agents in the process of fieldwork to decide what to show and what not to show to the researcher, and decide where we can go and where we cannot go. And along these lines, it's the researcher's ethical obligation to comply when lines are drawn and boundaries created, even though this process of consent unfolds in more or less explicit ways. And now it's time for some concluding remarks. In this presentation, I have shown how the participants' more or less explicit perceptions, understandings, and images of the fieldworker and the research study provide insights into different aspects of ethics as a social process, such as processes of informed consent, the negotiation of access to field sites, and the construction and description of social relations and roles in the field. On the basis of this, I have argued in favor for seeing ethics as a social process, which can be crystallized in the following 3 points. Ethics is shaped by and shapes the interactional encounter between relevant individuals in the field, such as the ethnographer, the participants, and occasional bystanders. Ethics is relational and may be interactionally renegotiated in the sense that ethical stances may be challenged and changed during longer or shorter periods of time. And this further entails an understanding of ethical decision-making as a dialogical enterprise and not a one-way street dominated by the researcher. And finally, ethics is context-dependent in the sense that ethical stances may alter according to the contextual setting of the fieldwork and thus calls for cross-contextual awareness. With regard to issues of informed consent, I've shown how processes of informed consent constitutes a chain of interactional events that follow both formal and informal trajectories. In this sense, consent and access is something that is continuously revisited during the fieldwork and closely connected to the process of construction, ascription, and negotiation of field roles and identities of the fieldworker and the participant. In addition, I have shown how such processes of negotiating access and informed consent occur across contexts and through different modes of communication in a multi-sided online and offline ethnography. And finally, I have shown how the participants' metascientific reflections provide knowledge about to what degree the participants and the researchers align in their understanding of whether consent is given and on what basis it is informed. On the basis of my analysis, I want to argue that being visible and accessible as a fieldworker is pertinent, especially when carrying out fieldwork in highly private online spaces. That is, through a combination of communicational means and through other inbuilt technological means of signaling, such as, for instance, the bitmojis and the push messages, as we saw in the case of the Snapchat group. Because as we saw in the analysis, such forms of visibility facilitated metascientific reflexivity and a continuous dialogue with the participants. Along these lines, we should not treat the participants as ethnographic dopes unable to understand the workings of modern science, but rather treat them as individuals entitled to have and maintain a high degree of agency in the context of being researched. Neither should we as researchers cling on to positivists' ideal of being the fly on the wall or the idea of being the silent observer behind the screen, but instead see it as an ethnographic opportunity when we, through our participation in the fieldwork, become entangled in the communicative flows of meta-scientific reflections of the people we study. Because such entanglement provides insights into when and how the ethical compass needs to be calibrated. So that's all for me, and thank you very much for listening.